The organ music died mid-note, and 300 guests turned as one to watch Adrian Cole walk backward down the aisle, away from the bride still standing at the altar in white lace, her bouquet trembling in her hands. He didn't whisper an apology. He didn't offer an explanation. He simply said, loud enough for every pew to hear, that he couldn't marry a woman whose father's company was worth more headlines than her heart, and then he turned and walked out of the cathedral doors into the gray afternoon, leaving Elena Marchetti standing alone in front of God, her family, and a room full of people who had come to watch her get chosen, and had instead watched her get discarded. Before we go further into Elena's story, if you believe people deserve second chances, if you believe love can find you in your darkest moment, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching this from tonight, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that heartbreak isn't the end of the story, and subscribe to Shadow Boss Tales so you never miss what happens next. Now, back to Elena. She stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, though it was only seconds, her mother's hand flying to her mouth, her father rising halfway from his seat with his jaw clenched so tight it looked carved from stone. Elena had spent 11 months planning this wedding. She had spent 4 years loving Adrian, believing in a future that had just evaporated in front of everyone who mattered to her. The whispers started immediately, guests leaning toward each other, phones already coming out of purses and pockets, because humiliation this public doesn't stay private for long. Elena felt the heat crawl up her neck, felt her vision blur, and for one terrible moment she thought she might simply collapse right there on the altar steps in front of everyone. That was the moment Dante Rosselli stood up from the fourth row. Nobody had properly introduced Dante to most of the guests, though a few older men in the crowd went pale the instant he rose, because they knew exactly who he was. Dante Rosselli ran half the shipping ports on the eastern coastline, and everyone who did business in this city knew that behind the tailored suits and quiet demeanor was a man who controlled far more than legitimate cargo. He was Elena's second cousin by a distant, complicated family thread, invited more out of respect for old family ties than closeness. He had not said more than a few polite words to Elena in years. But he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked down that same aisle Adrian had just fled, his footsteps echoing off marble instead of fading like the groom's had. He stopped in front of Elena, looked at her tear-streaked face, and then turned to face the stunned congregation. His voice, when it came, was calm in a way that somehow silenced the entire room faster than any shout could have. He said that if the groom didn't want her, then she was his, and he meant it not as a joke, not as a scandal, but as a vow spoken with more conviction than the one Adrian had never finished. Gasps rippled through the pews. Elena's mother began to cry harder, though now it seemed to be from something closer to shock than grief. Elena herself could only stare up at this man she barely knew, wondering if she had misheard him, wondering if the humiliation of the last 5 minutes had finally broken something in her mind. But Dante wasn't finished. He took her trembling hand gently in his and told her, quiet enough now that only she and the priest could hear, that she didn't have to say yes to anything today, that he wasn't asking her to marry a stranger out of pity or spectacle, only that she didn't deserve to stand there alone while people who called themselves her friends filmed her pain for entertainment. He asked her, simply, if she wanted to walk out of that cathedral on someone's arm instead of walking out alone, and told her the choice was entirely hers. Elena would later say that in that moment, something in her chest that had been clenched tight for months finally loosened, just slightly, enough to let her breathe. She nodded, unable to speak, and let him lead her back down the aisle, past the murmuring crowd, out into the daylight where his black car waited at the curb, engine already running, driver already stepping out to open the door. The following weeks were a blur of tabloid headlines and family phone calls Elena didn't answer. Her father, a proud businessman who had spent his life building a name in imports and logistics, was furious, not at Dante, but at the public disgrace, at the deals that might now unravel because his daughter had become gossip column material. Her mother oscillated between sympathy and quiet suspicion of the man who had swept her daughter away from her own wedding. Elena moved into a guest wing of Dante's estate, not because he demanded it, but because she couldn't bear to go home to an apartment full of wedding gifts addressed to a marriage that no longer existed. Dante gave her space. He was rarely home in those first 2 weeks, buried in whatever business kept men like him occupied at all hours, and when he was home, he never pushed, never asked her to explain herself or perform gratitude. He would simply sit with her some evenings in the study, a fire crackling, saying little, letting her cry or rage or sit in silence as she needed. Slowly, Elena began to notice things about him that contradicted everything she'd assumed from his reputation. He read poetry, hidden in a drawer like a secret shame. He remembered that she took her coffee with too much sugar and adjusted it without being asked. He had lost his own mother young and never spoke of his father at all, and Elena began to understand that the coldness people attributed to him was armor, not absence of feeling. But peace never lasts long for a man like Dante Rosselli. Word had spread fast through the underworld that the Rosselli family had taken in Adrian Cole's abandoned bride, and rival families saw opportunity in the chaos. A man named Victor Salgado, who had been trying to muscle into Dante's shipping routes for years, saw Elena as a weakness to exploit. He began making calls, subtle threats disguised as business propositions, hinting that Elena's presence in Dante's life made her a target, that her family's company could be squeezed from angles they never expected. When Elena discovered, through a frightened phone call from her father, that strange men had been asking questions about her at his offices, that veiled threats had been made linking her safety to Dante's business dealings, she felt the ground shift beneath her again. She confronted Dante that night, demanding to know what she had walked into, terrified she had traded one kind of danger for something far worse. Dante didn't lie to her. He told her plainly what his world was, what protecting her would require, and gave her the chance to leave, to go somewhere safe and far away if she wanted no part of it. He told her he would arrange it himself, no resentment, no strings. Elena sat with that offer for 3 days. She thought about Adrian, about the coward who had run from a simple promise in front of witnesses, and she thought about Dante, who had walked toward chaos in front of the same witnesses to shield her from shame. She realized that fear of the unknown had kept her small her whole life, kept her agreeing to a wedding that never felt right, kept her silent when Adrian's family made comments about her father's business being new money. She was tired of shrinking. On the 4th day, she told Dante she wasn't leaving, that if this was his world now, she wanted to understand it, to stand in it beside him rather than hide from it. What followed was not simple. Victor Salgado escalated, believing Dante distracted by romance meant Dante was weak, and he made the mistake of testing that theory by intercepting one of Dante's shipments and putting 2 of his men in the hospital. Dante's response was swift, calculated, and utterly without the softness Elena had come to know in their evenings together, and for the first time she saw the truth of what people whispered about him, the version of Dante capable of terrifying resolve. She should have been afraid of that man. Instead, she found herself standing firmly beside him when Salgado's people came to negotiate, refusing to be sent away for her own protection, insisting that whatever this relationship was becoming, she would not be the fragile thing men fought over from the sidelines. The confrontation with Salgado came to a head at a shipping yard on a rain-soaked night that Elena would never fully describe to anyone afterward, only that guns were drawn, that she had never been more frightened in her life, and that Dante had stepped in front of her without hesitation the instant threats turned physical. It ended not in bloodshed but in a tense standoff broken by the arrival of city officials Dante had quietly tipped off in advance, officials who had their own reasons to want Salgado's operation exposed. Salgado was arrested on charges that would keep him occupied for years, his network scattered, his threat neutralized without a single shot fired that night. Elena stood soaked in rain beside Dante as the sirens faded, shaking, alive, and strangely more certain of her place in the world than she had ever felt standing at that altar in white lace. In the months that followed, something quieter and steadier grew between them. Dante proposed to her not in a cathedral full of witnesses, not with fanfare or spectacle, but in the garden behind his estate on an ordinary Tuesday evening, kneeling in the grass with a ring that had belonged to his mother, telling Elena that he didn't need 300 guests to know what he felt, that he only needed her answer. She said yes without a single second of hesitation, tears streaming down her face for the first time in this story out of pure joy rather than grief. If this story has touched your heart even a little, if you found yourself rooting for Elena through every twist and turn, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who believes love can rebuild what heartbreak destroys. It genuinely helps this channel grow and lets us keep telling stories like hers. Their wedding, when it finally came, was small and quiet, nothing like the spectacle Adrian had abandoned her in. Her father walked her down the aisle with tears he didn't bother hiding, having long since come to respect the man who had protected his daughter with everything he had. Adrian was never spoken of again in that family, a footnote in a story that had grown into something far larger than the humiliation he had caused. Elena often thought, in quiet moments afterward, that she owed him an odd, bitter kind of gratitude, because his cowardice had cleared the path toward a love she never would have found otherwise, a love built not on appearances or approval but on choice, made freely, again and again, by two people who had both once been underestimated by the world around them. Before we close tonight, I'd love to hear from you. Please drop a comment below and tell me what part of Elena and Dante's story stayed with you the most, because your comments are what keep these stories alive on this channel. Elena Marchetti never became the woman who was left at the altar. She became the woman who was chosen, fiercely and completely, by a man the world feared but who had never once been anything but gentle with her heart. And if there's one thing her story teaches us, it's that the worst moment of your life might just be the doorway to the truest one. So if this story moved you even a little, let this video reach someone else who needs that reminder tonight. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next story here on Shadow Boss Tales.